Hello, this is Zahirul. Welcome you on Frankly Speaking. I have two very special guests today. They are from United States visiting Bangladesh. Let me introduce them first with you. I have Kelly Faye Rodriguez, Special Representative for International Affairs at the U.S. State Department. Welcome, Kelly Rodriguez on Frankly Speaking. And I have another guest, Ms. Tia Lee. Tia Lee is the Deputy Undersecretary for International Labor Affairs at the U.S. Department of Labor. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Zahid. It is a delight to be here.
It's a pleasure. Tia Lee, she advocates for workers' rights, fair wages, and safe working conditions in international trade in the U.S. Department of Labor. Thank you. Thank you for joining, Kelly. First of all, let me begin with your plan, United States plan about Bangladesh and United States trade policies. We know that Bangladesh's largest export market in the United States, especially for the RMG sector. So how the United States plan to balance about its international trade policies with labor concerns related to Bangladesh, and how you are moving forward to foster relations with Bangladesh, to strengthen relations with Bangladesh.
Thank you. So the United States has, for 50 years, worked closely with Bangladesh in partnership. We have worked on promoting labor rights and standards and promoting workers and freedom of association in our shared supply chains. And for us, worker empowerment is critical to economic growth, to inclusive economic development. It's pivotal for human rights, for economic resilience, and it's why we place such a high value on international labor rights and making sure that workers can exercise them. We are here on a U.S. delegation. We've invited guests to join us from the United States, including private sector leaders, senior officials from American brands who invest and purchase from Bangladesh's ready-made garment sector. And we also have global labor experts. We've got the Secretary General of a global union federation and a labor rights expert from the Worker Rights Consortium. The American Apparel Footwear Association, the American Buyers Association, essentially, for garment, has worked with us on this delegation. And the goal is to really just show and demonstrate that the US government, the private sector, and labor are supportive of Bangladeshi workers and making sure that we work together to raise standards and protect rights for Bangladeshi workers in the garment sector.
Okay, Tia, it's a very important delegation, definitely. So in your view, how much progress Bangladesh has made over the years related to the labor rights concerns from the United States end?
Thank you, Zahid, for that question. We've been working with Bangladesh for a very long time, as Kelly said, and there has been a lot of progress. We are really looking forward to working with the interim government. We know there have been commitments made about establishing a labor rights reform commission, about implementing really important labor reforms, and so I think this is in process. We are working on making progress on these important areas. One of the key things for us is the Bangladesh Labor Act, making sure that Bangladeshi labor law is in compliance with International Labor Organization standards, especially with respect to freedom of association and collective bargaining, making sure that workers have the ability to form independent and democratic unions of their own choosing without any interference from management or from the government. So that is a crucial area for us. And in particular, we also want to see the Bangladesh Labor Act include the export processing zones. There should be a unified single labor law protecting workers' rights in Bangladesh. We also want to make sure that as we have these conversations that we are addressing some of the long-standing concerns around violence or harassment that workers have faced as they've tried in the past to organize independent democratic unions. Some have been falsely arrested and accused, and we think that it's very important that you can't have a vibrant, independent democratic union movement if workers live in fear of retaliation, of being fired, of being blacklisted for exercising their internationally recognized rights. So we also want to be in conversation with the government, and as Kelly said, we've brought our private sector and labor experts with us to make sure that we are moving these conversations forward. Also addressing issues about fair pay, minimum wage, and that is, I know, a long-standing discussion. All of these issues are very much in conversation here in Bangladesh, and we hope to be part of that conversation.
So there's a lot of concerns related to this, but how much progress, again to you, Kelly, how much progress Bangladesh already have made towards, and what suggestions, or if you got any specific suggestions for improvement on those issues Thea already raised?
I mean, we've had the chance to work with and know incredible leaders in the labor movement here. And it's really hard to organize workers anywhere, in any sector. It's a hard thing to do. And here in Bangladesh, there's a history of workers fighting for their rights and organizing at great risk. Thea mentioned harassment, intimidation, violence. We were very, very sad to learn about the death of Zahirul Islam last year, and other workers who were killed in the last year, simply, exercising their rights. So those are things that we know there's a lot more we can do. We are, as Thea mentioned, thrilled to be able to work with the Bangladesh government on that. We've had conversations with the interim government, and we are here to show support for making progress on those issues. I'll say also it's a special personal opportunity for me to be here at this time. I lived and worked in Bangladesh for just under 2 years, working on labor rights at an NGO, the Solidarity Center, that supports garment worker organizing. And to be able to be here representing the U.S. government at this time to say that the U.S. has your back, that we are here, again, with all of the private sector and labor expertise and capacity, because we know we all have a role and a responsibility in making sure that Bangladeshi workers have what they need to thrive and to be able to support their families, right? And to be able to work and not be afraid of harassment or intimidation.
Thea, yes, please.
Oh, I just wanted to say how important we see this as for the future of Bangladesh. That Bangladesh is poised to be a real important player and actor in the global economy. But if they can address these long-standing concerns around labor rights, labor protections, around safe and healthy workplaces, I think Bangladesh really could benefit from this conversation. This is something that the European Union, the United States, Canada, many governments are looking to improve due diligence in supply chains, transparency, accountability, and integrity in supply chains. I would like to see Bangladesh poised to benefit from that movement, to be able to really point to a thriving independent labor movement and a good labor inspection and enforcement system, a registration system for unions, a labor justice system that works. And I think those elements are really important, and that's why we're here this week.
You mentioned that you are looking forward to working with the interim government, but reforms has always been a painstaking process, and Bangladesh also trying to improve these labor standards and other challenges, what you have mentioned. But after the changeover in 5th of August, and what challenges you were looking at in terms of collaborating with the current government?
Well, we're thrilled to have a lot of meetings with a lot of agencies in the interim government this week, and we certainly see that there has been a commitment on the part of the interim government to address these long-standing concerns. Certainly that happened at the International Labor Organization this summer. There has been a commitment to move forward on the labor action plan that the U.S. government and Bangladesh have agreed to, that the ILO has blessed. There are concrete, achievable reforms that are laid out, but their speed is of the essence. We don't have forever to sit around, because we'd like to see that Bangladesh Labor Act unified with the EPZs, done in time for the next governing body meeting of the ILO. And that is, so it's really important that the tripartite consultative committee be formed, be established, that workers be at the table along with the private sector, along with the government. So I think there are really promising steps that have been put in place. But it is up to the interim government, it is up to the Bangladeshi people to make sure that these get over the finish line in a timely way.
Oh, yeah, Kelly, in terms of freedom of association or collective bargaining, I mean, to empower them, empower the system, what specific measures can Bangladesh envision or what Bangladesh can take to strengthen this process and get some reform in the law?
I mean, the reforms that Thea's mentioned so far are going to be critical. Making sure that we start with dropping the criminal charges against workers who were simply protesting the minimum wage over the last year. Those kinds of criminal cases against workers, they send a message to workers that they can't exercise their rights. And that kind of fear and chilling of rights is something that's going to take action to reverse. We've seen it work in other places, and it's possible, it's feasible, and you've got the Labor Rights Commission that's been established here in Bangladesh. You've got experts and an interim government that is committed to taking steps to address those things. Certainly sending a message that workers will not be criminalized simply for exercising their rights is crucial. The minimum wage setting process, right? Bringing that into line with practices in other countries and sectors in the region, right? Like more regular minimum wage setting, and doing it with the participation of independent democratic unions. I mean, that's something that we're going to need to see grow in the Bangladesh RMG sector in order for anything else to work, right? We know that simply fixing the laws isn't going to be enough. We're going to need people in the government, in the private sector, and independent democratic unions to work together to make sure that standards improve, and to make sure that the sector continues to thrive. It's doing really well, and we all, the global consumer community, relies on Bangladesh, right? Major producer of garment. And so minimum wage, dropping the criminal cases, and bringing the legislation into line with international standards, making sure the EPZ workers are also covered the same as those outside of the EPZ. Those are the pieces that are going to put Bangladesh in a place to really have it be competitive in the global market, given the legislation and really the modern trade practices that we're seeing, right? U.S. Trade policy relies on labor standards and relies on the premise that workers have the ability to exercise their rights to organize and have a voice in the supply chain and in standard setting. And so those are the things that we are excited to work with the Bangladesh government on achieving.
How do you see the commitment from the stakeholders, the partners, including the government?
I think that is one of the things that is most optimistic, is that we have strong commitment. I think the private sector is aware that change is coming, that change is necessary. And I think that the workers are ready.
Do they acknowledge this?
They do acknowledge it. I mean, certainly that's why we're bringing the private sector with us on this delegation to some of the meetings that we are doing with the interim government, because the private sector is a partner, can be a partner for us in this. We want to see them make sure that they're making a commitment to pay fair prices, to abide by the law, to respect workers' right to organize. And certainly from the United States, the American Apparel and Footwear Association, which buys a lot of the apparel, has written a letter to the chief advisor, to Mr. Yunus, expressing the importance of labor rights and labor reform in their calculations. So I think a lot of companies, and we hear it from the European Union as well, companies are looking to countries that have the capacity, the ability, and the will to implement systemic labor reforms. And we are very optimistic that Bangladesh is ready and willing to make those changes.
How distant is Bangladesh from the international labor standard, international labor practices? How far we are staying up?
I mean, we for years have been talking at the ILO with the EU and through our trade engagement about the steps that need to be taken to bring Bangladesh into compliance. I think it's clear what needs to happen, and we're hearing the right messages. We're looking forward to really making it real on the ground for workers. And we have the chance to do that in the short term right now.
And I wanted to add one particular thing that I don't think we've spoken about yet, but the high threshold for union registration. It shouldn't be so hard. for workers at a workplace to come together and say they want a union and to go get registered and to be to have a vehicle for collective bargaining, for raising concerns at the workplace, whether it's safety and health or harassment or wages. Workers need to have a vehicle, and this is really essential. This is what a thriving, robust democracy at the workplace looks like, is for workers to have the ability to form their own independent democratic organization so they can have a voice. That's also what allows workers to have a voice in the policy-making process, to have representative unions that can be at the table, whether it's around minimum wage or whether it's around union registration or freedom of association or collective bargaining.
Complete participatory must be.
Participating so that for the interim government to welcome, and they have already by putting on the Labor Rights Commission, the Labor Rights Reform Commission, they have put union representatives, worker representatives on that commission. That is an important first step, and that is one of the reasons we are so optimistic.
Any suggestions of that threshold level? 15% or low?
It needs to be in compliance with International Labor Organization standards. So I think that is the key piece. Also, and just to make sure that there are not obstacles, when the workers go, that there is not corruption or political favoritism in terms of which unions can be registered. They should be able to legitimately say, we have a majority of workers at this workplace, we have an interest from the workers, and we'd like to see as few obstacles as possible.
Before we begin our next round of discussion, I will deal with something related to our labor standard and international policies and US stand on this. But you mentioned that you worked in Bangladesh during 2018, and you learned some Bangla.
Ektu Bangla Jani.
Very good. Should you continue in Bangla?
It's been a while. But no, I really enjoyed the time here and met incredible people doing really wonderful work. And I have a lot of love for Bangladesh.
Fantastic. Thank you. Tia, we are discussing about how Bangladesh can improve more related to their labor standard, labor law, and some rights and some concerns related to their workers' rights, minimum wage and everything, freedom of association, also threshold level. But there are also some concern related to the opposite end. US definitely one of the largest exporting destination of Bangladesh. So they some US buyers and brands dominate this market. So in this end, from Bangladesh end, they see that the brands and buyers also got some responsibility, some accountability related to minimum wage, related to ethical pricing, related to fair prices. How do you address those issues?
Thank you, Zahid. I think that is such an important question, and that's one of the reasons that we are here. We're bringing with us some of the American brands because we do see that there is shared responsibility. Labor rights is always going to be a cooperation between government, employers, and workers, and they each have a responsibility. On the part of the big buyers, the big global apparel brands, they have a responsibility to make sure that they are in compliance with international labor rights as well. And also, but I think a little bit more than that. Obviously they need to abide by the law and to be lawful, but they also need to go, in our view, a little bit further, which is we want to see them engage with governments to say, we need a consistent labor rights enforcement and regulatory environment, because that is what creates stability and certainty, which is important for business. And a lot of the changes we're talking about in terms of improving workers' ability to organize are actually good for business. Because businesses, high standard businesses with big brand names, they need to be able to assure their customers that they have integrity and accountability and transparency throughout their supply chains. They need to know that workers are not being abused, that workers are working in healthy and safe conditions. There aren't problems with child labor or forced labor or discrimination in their own supply chains. And so that is part of why we're here this week in conjunction with big American brand names, because we want the companies to also reinforce the message to the interim government that improving labor rights, improving labor laws, improving enforcement of labor laws, ensuring that workers have the ability to organize and bargain collectively is important for business as well as for labor stakeholders, as well as for governments.
Kelly, creating a conducive atmosphere is in the interest of Bangladesh for better future, for better economic, bright future. So, but the stakeholders like government, they always say about the resource constraint. And also the, the other stakeholders like owners, they have resource constraint in terms when they deal with wage. So, how a country when they're facing constraints related to resource, economic crunch or crises, how they can deal with and what specific measures Bangladesh can take during the, economic crunch or difficult situation?
You know, actually in one of our meetings so far, someone mentioned that out of crisis can come progress. And it stuck with me because I think Bangladesh has experienced a variety of challenges in its history. And this is a really crucial moment and time to use that opportunity to really make changes that have been, that many folks have been waiting for a long time. And as Thea mentioned, there's a business case to be made for investing in workforce capacity, worker empowerment, right? There's more sustainable business practices that come out of having an organized workforce. We've been doing this work around the world for the last few years. We've seen in countries that had independent democratic unions, that had years of practice engaging constructively with empowered workers, they were able to overcome the pandemic in ways that non-unionized sectors were not, because they didn't have that ability and that natural experience of being able to negotiate and engage constructively for the well-being of a business. Workers need their jobs. They want a business that's going to be successful. And businesses should want their workers to feel and be empowered to contribute to the success of a business, right? So we understand there's limited resources, there's always going to be crunches, but there's valid reasons for companies to invest, to take the time, and to really embrace an organized workforce. The other thing I would add to the private sector piece is that the brands, we've been working with the American Apparel and Footwear Association. As they issued a letter to Chief Advisor Yunus, as Thea mentioned, and in that letter they articulated the importance of regular and regularized minimum wage setting, and they understand that they have a role to play in making sure that pricing and sourcing practices allow for companies to be able to pay a good wage, right? To pay a decent wage and to be able to have an organized workforce. And that is something that we in the US, but we're seeing also in the EU legislation, Canada and Australia, there is growing awareness and understanding that all actors across the supply chain, not just the employer, right? Brands, purchasing companies, wherever they are on a supply chain, they all have a role and a responsibility in making sure that workers at the bottom of the supply chain, that their rights are respected, that their wages allow them to live a decent life, right?
In order to, yes, please.
I just wanted to add one thing to that. In terms of resource constraints, you asked about that. I think there's short-term and long-term thinking. In the short term, it may be that people would say, well, I can't afford to pay more because this is what I have. But what we found, and what like the US Treasury issued a report on unions and the importance of unions in the United States, that it actually is a good long-term business strategy because you reduce turnover, you improve skill, you improve morale, and so that productivity can actually go up. And so that is an important consideration. We think about resource constraints. And the same thing for the government, you could say, well, we don't have enough resources to enforce labor laws or to hire labor inspectors. But that's short-term thinking. In the long to medium term, if you want to be that trusted market, you want to be able to really assert and to prove that you are protecting workers' rights, then you can attract more brands. And the brands, as you say, the important piece is that this is where the money is. These are companies that are selling high-priced goods to wealthy consumers. They need to make sure that they are organizing their business in a way that they can pay workers a living wage.
So one more thing. in dealing with all those challenges, all those, Bangladesh is looking at the United States goodwill, especially GSP, restoration of GSP facilities. So, we talked about brand and buyers' responsibility, their accountability, also goodwill from the U.S. government about restoration, regaining the facilities.
Well, absolutely. And the U.S. government has, as we've talked about, developed a labor action plan, an 11-point labor action plan that puts out concrete, achievable steps in labor reform that Bangladesh would need to take in order to regain GSP benefits once that is reauthorized in the United States. So we feel like working with the ILO, working with the US and the European Union, there are very concrete steps, including the reform of the Bangladeshi labor law, bringing the EPZ in, addressing minimum wage, addressing the false arrests of labor advocates and so on. So each of those, the concrete steps are there. I think the government is well aware of them. We are working together to work through that labor action plan so that Bangladesh can bring itself into compliance and be able to be eligible once GSP is reauthorized in the United States for the restoration of GSP benefits.
What message from your side?
The same. Just to add that we've had a worker-centered trade model and agenda for the last several years, and we're not turning back, right? There will not be a future U.S. trade agreement that does not have strong labor protections. There's bipartisan consensus on this out of our legislature. No matter in the future for the U.S. to have a trade agreement with any country, it's going to build on what we've done so far. The U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement had unprecedented labor provisions, money, $180 million for labor rights awareness raising, education, for ensuring that workers are able to organize. And so when you think about the trajectory of U.S. trade and economic engagement, it is only going to continue to uplift the importance of freedom of association and labor rights and standards. And so this is why this work in the coming weeks and months and over the next year is just going to be really important for the economic relationship.
I mentioned that all those reforms and changes and enforcement and development is in the interest of Bangladesh, definitely, for a better future, for a brighter future, no denying to that. But some staunch critic, some blunt critic says this, the positions or the issues or the concerns related to the United States and to labor standard, improving labor standard is over politicized. Some people say that this is prescriptive, sort of sounds prescriptive. How do you?
Well, I think you mentioned goodwill, and I think we're at a moment of tremendous goodwill between the interim government and the U.S. government. We see eye to eye on a lot of these issues. This is very much in Bangladesh's interest. This is about Bangladesh's economic future, their place in the global economy. I think Bangladesh has tremendous potential, and we want to see Bangladesh reach its potential. So we are very much in partnership with the interim government now, and we are really happy that there is an openness and a willingness to discuss these really important reforms. Every country that is a member of the International Labor Organization has in principle made that commitment to bring its laws into compliance with international labor standards. So this is really part of a joint conversation about the future of Bangladesh, the future of Bangladeshi workers, but also the future of Bangladesh industry and exports. And we want that to be a strong future.
Yeah,
I would just say, and it's not just the U.S., right? We understand the EU, Canada, others are also in the same, taking the same approach. So this is really, it is an international effort to support the future of Bangladesh.
Kelly, some challenges are short term. You both mentioned and recognized that we have constraint. In many areas we have constraints, especially say, for example, that for enforcement, better enforcement, there are not enough for adequate inspectors. So these are some limitations or shortcomings are short-term, mid-term, or long-term. So in terms of dealing with the short-term limitations or challenges, how
do you prioritize? Right?
Yeah. So
No, look, again, this is culture change, and we've seen it work in other places, particularly when you have governments that are committed and working together. And it's a long-term effort. But the beginning and the first steps are what we've been focusing on, which is you need to get the laws right on the books, and which is bringing in the BLA into compliance with international standards, and you need to send the message that there's accountability, transparency, that workers are free to exercise their rights. And you do that by dropping the criminal cases and charges against the workers from the last several years, and setting the framework in place for future success. So the minimum wage setting process, right? Ensuring that the independent democratic unions have a seat at the table. Those are all, and many of these steps they've already started to take them. Again, with the Labor Rights Commission that has been established. These are crucial to give the framework or the tools that Bangladesh will need to carry out the longer term efforts.
Yeah, we're almost at the end of our program here. When you talk about reducing or improvement in the areas of harassment or intimidation or violence against the workers or work union leaders, at the same time, there is some, just discussion related to the labor rights, some provocation to incite violence or to creating unrest or uncertainty, and that will eventually jeopardize the interest of our R&D sector and other sectors. So how to deal with this?
Thank you for that question. I think what's really important is that if the labor movement has more freedom to form actual legitimate independent and democratic unions, that those can be a force for stability. Because if workers have a way to express their grievances, to bargain collectively with their employer, they're less likely to have to go out and resort to other measures. And so I think that really the establishment of free, independent, democratic unions is essential to stability going forward. It's essential to democracy. And so those are the kinds of issues that we hope will be there. And we're very heartened that the interim government has set labor rights reform and justice reform as priorities. We think those are key elements.
I mean, if I could just add, I saw that here. I saw independent democratic trade union leaders go into factories and negotiate solutions when workers in other factories where there wasn't a union took to the streets, right? And so Bangladesh has the experience of benefiting from those examples. We just need more of them. And we just need to give them space and room and support for them to be able to do that work.
Just related to the spirit of spreading social dialogue.
Yes, social dialogue is so important.
Social dialogue is so important. Thank you very much, Lee. Thank you very much, Kelly Rodriguez, for making time and talking about the very precious, important, and critical issues related to our improving labor rights and relations between the United States and Bangladesh in the coming days.
Thank you so much, Zahid. It has been our pleasure.
Thank you.
Dear viewers, that's all my discussion with Kelly Rodriguez, Special Representative from the United State Department, and Ms. Thea Lee, Deputy Undersecretary of Department of Labor from the United States. We hope you enjoyed the discussion. We look forward to invite you to our next episode. Until then, to take care and bye.